Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Leading Yourself podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be talking all about pivoting because 2020 has been a year where many have been forced to pivot. So let's talk about what is pivoting, why it happens, and what are some things we need to think about when considering pivoting. Let's dig into today's episode. Welcome to the Leading Yourself podcast. This is your host, Carolina de Arriba. I'm an HR professional, health and fitness coach, wife, mom, and above all things, a goal-getter. In this podcast, we're going to be digging into all things leadership, professional and career development, habits, and relationships. This is a podcast for those who want to become the best version of themselves. Those who have big dreams and are willing to embrace the journey and put in the work to achieve them. My goal is to share with you the tools, tips, and tricks to help you in your journey. So let's dig into today's episode. Okay, 2 episodes ago, I was talking about winning over 2020. And I mentioned certain things that from my perspective we need in order to end the year strong and win over 2020. I talked about mindset. I talked about clarity, which I went more in depth into that topic in last week's episode. Another thing that I talked about was pivoting. And that is what I want to talk about today. Because I think this year, 2020, has been a year where many have been forced to pivot for reasons that maybe weren't even under their control, but life events that happened that forced them to pivot. And I think that if we can draw a lesson from this year and what has happened this year is that life is always going to create a pivot. Things are going to happen around us that are going to create a pivot. And it's up to us to take charge, or if we don't, then in automatic, we're letting life take charge of that. And when we let life take charge, typically doesn't end up in a good place. It takes us to a destination or a direction that is not aligned with our vision and our purpose. But many times we are afraid of taking charge because the events happening around us are clouding our mind, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. But I think one thing that I've learned over time in the instances where I've personally had to pivot is that if you take charge, you will always figure it out. You will always find a way to make it work. And having that belief and starting out of that belief is so important when you think about pivoting. If you believe deep inside yourself that if you take charge, you're going to find a way to figure it out, you'll find a way to figure it out. But before I jump too ahead on the topic, let's talk about why would we pivot. Typically, pivoting happens as a result from a disruptive event or a life change. Things like losing a job, getting divorced, getting married, the death of a loved one. But it also comes from that restless knowing that it's time for a change. It can be inspired by the decision to move in a different direction. Maybe you took a path, maybe it's in your career or your personal life, and you have gone through that path to figure out that that path wasn't what you were expecting it was going to be. It doesn't look anything like what you were expecting, and then it's time to change directions. So big life events, disruptive events, restless knowing that it's time for a change, or the decision to move to a new direction. All those are reasons why we face a pivot moment. And I want to talk today about a little bit of things to think about as we are considering pivoting or how to pivot. So I've heard these 3 lessons that I completely agree and I've seen playing out in my life. The first one is that life is less about what happens to you and more about how you react about what happens to you. I mentioned this many times in many other episodes, but we cannot control the things that are happening around us. Life is always going to happen and it's out of our control. It's not something that we can always control. Many of those disruptive events happening around us or these life-changing events are happening without our control. And while we can control those events, we can control the way we react to them. And how we react to those events is going to take us to the next life lesson, which is that life is less about what happens to you and more about the meaning you give to things. And I think that, when all these events happen around us, life gets hard, it's challenging, but we need to deeply believe that we are in charge and that we can always adjust and better our lives in any given point in time. Now, when we are in the middle of a hard season or a hard event in our lives, a lot of times it's cloudy, right? We're clouded by those events and how they make us feel. And we get stuck in things like, why is this happening to me? Why is this happening now? And things of that sort where we question the events and the events, not only in its sense of the events, but in the events as they relate to us and being impacting us. And we see that all these things are happening to us. But I think a lot of times we need to stop for a minute, take a pause, and don't let those hard things keep us from doing what we think and we know we need to do. So the key question is, how are you going to respond to the events that are happening around you? Because on how you respond to those events is your ability to take charge and either stay put in the course in which you are and walk through that hard season, knowing that at the end of that hard season, you're going to be back on track with your journey and you're going to be heading towards that destination that you want to achieve, or to make the decision and take charge of our decision to pivot. So the second lesson that I mentioned is life is less about what happens to you and it's more about the meaning you give to what happens to you. I think this is all about perspective, right? And perspective is something that we can also control. Our perspectives gives meaning to everything in our lives. Depending from what perspective we look at a certain event is the meaning we're going to give to that event in our lives. And if we are able to take charge of our perspective, to give meaning to the things that are happening, then we're going to see those things as happening for us instead of to us. I think a lot of times, as I said, we get stuck in the situation and it feels hard and it feels like life is over, like it's the end, like there's no hope in this situation and we feel trapped and stuck in that situation. But how many times have you gone through hard things before? And for me, always when I go through a hard season or a hard event, I always ask myself and remind myself that I've gone through harder things before. And that helps me put things in perspective. In the minute, sounds like that event is the end of the world. But when I'm able to zoom out and see the bigger picture, then I can see things from a different perspective. And I know that this is temporary, that it will pass. And the key question then you need to ask yourself is, what meaning am I going to find in this particular season in my life, in this hard moment? Because years from now, and typically this is what happens, we don't find the meaning of what's happening when we are in the middle of what's happening. We typically find meaning of what's happening when we are ahead in the future, right? And we go and look back, and then we find meaning in those events that happen. I'll give you an example. When I was a teenager, our entire family moved from Spain to Honduras. At the time, when I was in the middle of that transition, I couldn't stop asking myself why and keep trying to blame others for that situation. And I block myself and get stuck in this is hard and I don't like it and I want to go back with my friends. This was at a time where there was no WhatsApp, and I don't think I even had an email account. That tells how old I am, but I remember writing like traditional letters to my friends that would take a month to get to them. And by the time I had a response, I didn't even remember what I wrote in the first place. But that was a hard season in my life. Now, in the present, I look back and I find meaning in that. Thanks to that experience, I am where I am today. I learned so much from that experience. If it wasn't because we moved to Honduras, I would have never met my husband. And my life would have been completely different than what it is today. So when we are in the middle of hard things, it's difficult to find meaning, but we need to try our best to find meaning on it and try to look back and find meaning on those past experiences. But as you are in the middle of that hard season and things get uncomfortable, you need to make a decision if they are to a point where you need to shift and pivot and go in a new direction, or once again, you're going to stay put and get through that hard season knowing that it takes that hard season to get to your destination. But many times, when we are in that hard season and even we know that it is time to pivot, because I think our instincts sometimes speak to us and let us know that it is time to pivot. We're so afraid of pivoting because we're afraid of the process. We are afraid because if we shift directions, then we're starting from scratch. And as we start from scratch, it takes a learning curve to get up to speed in that new path. And we are so afraid of what others might think of us if we pivot right now. We are so afraid of making mistakes. We're so afraid of not knowing what to do, that fear of the process keep us from pivoting. So I love this saying that says, focus on progress over perfection and fall in love with the process. Focus on progress over perception and fall in love with the process. You know, we might have a goal in mind, right? And many times we achieve that goal and it doesn't feel the way that we thought it was going to feel once we arrive there. And the truth is that we spend more time in the journey than we do in the destination. So we need to fall in love with that journey, with that process. Many people fell in love with the outcomes, with the results, but they're afraid of what it's going to take to get there. They're afraid of the process to get there because we know that process is going to be hard. But in order to achieve big things, we need to go to hard processes. It's just how it works. There's no shortcuts. So we need to keep in mind that as we're pivoting and we're going in a new direction, we're starting from scratch. And we need to take one step at a time and try to let go of our fears of what others might think of us and just take one step at a time and learn as we go. You know, for me, I'm relating to what I'm just saying because when I started this podcast, I was so afraid of what others might think of me. I was afraid of what my colleagues at work might think of me for starting this new path, right? Following my passion by doing this podcast. And I was so afraid of what they would say that I was trying to be perfect from the very beginning. And that was just not possible because I was starting. I had no idea about how to do a podcast. And that's why it took me so long to finally just get started. And once I got started, I started to lose that fear and start falling in love with the process. And now I look back and I find meaning in all those things that happened that led me to be where I am today. The next lesson is life is less about what happens to you and it's more about how you use what happens to you. So a lot of times we pivot, we shift directions, and we forget about the previous path that we were on. And we think like we're starting completely from scratch and nothing that happened in the past counts. And that's not true because I think every experience that we go through in life is just preparing us for the next steps in our journey. A lot of the things that we learned in previous experiences, we're going to be able to leverage in new experiences. So your past experiences are not a waste. They build you and they help you become the person that you are today, so you're ready to take this new path that you're going on right now. You will not be able to pivot if it wasn't for those past experiences that you went through. So we need to learn not to discard our past, but to use our past to help us propose ourselves into our future and leverage and transfer all the things that we've learned in past experiences. As we pivot, right, and we're learning, and one mistake that we typically make is that we start comparing ourselves with people that are way ahead of us in our journey. And because we're not as good as they are, we feel that it was a wrong decision to pivot. And I think we need to be very careful because we can't compare our beginning with someone else's end of the journey, right? We need to be realistic. I also believe that it's important to find role models. So while we should not fixate on where other people is and compare ourselves to those people in order to feel inferior and less and end up giving up, we need to look up for people that have gone through the same journey that we're going right now. People that have been where we have been now and now they're ahead of us. It's like, I started training for a 5K. I've never run in my life. I know nothing about running. So I had to look up for people to ask questions, right? As to, recommendations of what are the right running shoes and what gear I need and how to get started and what app can I use to track my runs and all those things. I'm not going to go to someone that, like me, has never run to ask those questions. I need to go to someone who is better than I am at running, that it's ahead of me in this journey to ask the questions. So identify and find people who have been or where you want to go and use them as role models. Use them as mentors, as coaches that can help you in your journey. Because I think that whatever new journey you take, there's someone that has already gone through that journey. So find who has already gone through that path and identify your role models, your mentors, and your coaches. And as you change paths, I think the other component that is very important, I talked about this on an episode where I talked about habits, but it's changing your environment. If you were doing something and now you're pivoting into something else and you're staying in the same environment, your mindset is not going to be where it needs to be. Our environment plays such an important role in our mindset and our perspective. So you need to set your environment to help you or prepare you to be successful in this new journey that you're taking. That environment also involves the people that we surround ourselves with. So in previous episodes, I talked about the fact that we are the combination of the 5 people that we spend the most time with. And when you pivot and you change directions, you need to assess who those 5 people are. Because those 5 people that you have been surrounding yourself with may have been the perfect people to surround yourself with when you were in the previous path. But now that you're in a new path, maybe you need to audit who those people are and mix it up. See what is missing in your circle so you can be intentional about who you invite to that circle of people that you surround yourself with. So, those are 3 lessons in life that are related to pivoting. Now, when we pivot, there are different ways to do it, right? Sometimes we are forced by a major life event like losing a job. In that case, we need to do a full pivoting, right? We need to find a new job or start a new business or do something different. But sometimes when your pivoting comes from, as I said, your restless need for change or the fact that you find out that the path that you're in is not fulfilling your purpose and you want to change directions, sometimes it's better to start that in parallel to our current path and be walking 2 paths in parallel. You know, for me, one of the reasons that I started this podcast, for example, I mentioned this in the past, but is I love mentoring and I wanted to make a bigger impact and reach to more people. Another reason why I started this podcast is because I was looking for a level of fulfillment that a year ago I wasn't getting. And I didn't just, quit my job or do radical changes in my life in order to start my podcast. I just started my podcast on the side to all the things that were already on my life. And now I know that I can do both. There's no need to give up on one to do the other one, especially because I love my job and I'm very passionate about what I do. But a lot of times we believe that pivoting means giving up or stopping on something and starting something new. And it doesn't have to be that way. Many times pivoting can be adding new things to your life, making an audit to your life and say, what can I take out of my life that is not fulfilling me, that is not adding value to me or those that I love, so I can make the space to add the things that are going to fulfill me and are going to add that change in my life that I'm so desperate looking for. I want to end this episode talking about what is the main thing holding us back from pivoting, whether it's a full range pivot or a small pivot, right? And I think that whether it's a small or a big pivoting event, the main reason holding us back is us. Is those voices in the back of our head that are telling us not to explore new territory because we are afraid of the unknown. So it's important that we get out of our own way. It's important that we stop worrying about what others might think. It's important that we stop trying to be perfect. It's important that we stop making excuses for ourselves because we can sometimes be our worst enemy. I think if we want to achieve momentum in whatever passion we want to follow, whatever purpose we want to follow, we only can achieve momentum through action. I heard someone doing this analogy, but it's like a car on a freeway, right? It uses much less gas than when you are driving in the city because objects that are in movement stay in movement. And I think the same happens in our lives. We need to create momentum, and the only way to create momentum is by taking action. A lot of times we feel that it's all about motivation, but I talked about this in the past. We don't need motivation. What we need are habits that are going to create momentum in our lives. And that only happens by us taking action. So once again, I'm going to end the same way that I started. Life is always going to create a pivot. We can either take charge or we can let life take charge. And if we decide to take charge, we will always figure it out. As always, I hope you found today's episode interesting and inspiring. If you did, please head to Apple Podcasts and leave me a review. Since you're already there, make sure you subscribe so you get notifications every time there's a new podcast episode available. And finally, please share this episode with someone in your life that can benefit from today's content. With that, I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you again for another episode of the Leading Yourself podcast. Did you listen to last week's podcast episode about clarity? If you didn't, I really recommend you to push and play on that episode. And if seeking clarity is something that you think is what you need right now in your life, what you need right now in this stage of the year, I want to invite you to join me for my Vision Board Workshop. It's going to be taking place on November 6th. You can see all the details and sign up on the link on the comments of this podcast. I hope to see you there.